Ahoy! There is even more new loot on the PTR than we originally expected or were aware of. This was discovered by Five Hat Survival Gaming yesterday, and I wanted to discuss this a little bit because I think these perks are actually somewhat better than you would expect. So what we can see here is the first of them, which is the rushing plate boots pattern, rushing implying outpost rush in this case. So these are the items you can get. They don't actually show up properly on UL database yet in case of the rushing gear. You can see that it's used in a recipe for these boots, but it doesn't show you where you get it. If you look at the warring version, which you can get from being in a war, then you can actually see that this particular one here, for example, the code, is linked to the war spoils. So you can see that at any level you can get these patterns. So even if you were in a low-level war, you could get these patterns, and they can then be used to craft. And once again, they come with a somewhat unique perk layout. The first example that we have here is the rushing gear, the armor, that simply comes with resilient locked when you craft it. Not particularly impressive here, but it's also buy and equip, so you can possibly sell it. There's really not much to this one. This is the most basic one you can see. You have, for example, the very normal perk buckets here in terms of perks. You can just get any mix, and you also have a normal perk bucket here when it comes to the effects you can get. Obviously, you can't get resilient. That's out of there, but everything else is in there as usual. You even have the more annoying things like blight resistance, like indestructible. It's all in there. Not one of the new PvP perk pools, so to speak, but very interesting no less. The resources required here are also very basic, but obviously you can't lock attributes, so it's not necessarily the best gamble when it comes to what you can roll with this when it comes to Resilient, because Resilient already has a high roll. So I would say the rushing set is probably the worst one of them. That said, there are also the rushing weapons, which are a lot more interesting, because what you can see here on the sword right away is that it has strength locked and vicious locked. And that applies for all of the different weapons. They all have perks locked that match them. On the rapier, for example, you have dexterity and vicious locked. On the hatchet, you have strength and vicious. On the warhammer, you have strength and vicious, and so on. Obviously, every weapon comes with the matching perk here. So if you are looking for a vicious weapon, again, vicious is a fairly common role, so it's not necessarily something that people would directly be after, but if that's what you want, then this is a very easy way to get it. And because you don't need any attribute mods here, this is a very easy way to get exactly the attribute that you like. So I like this already. It's also funny enough, vicious on the life staff here, so obviously not very good. And we always have the outlier with the shields. In this case, the shields have their attribute locked as well, but then they have Empowering Breaker on the round shield, as well as on the kite shield. But on the tower shield, they have Sturdy Energy, and this one has Con as well. I don't think that's necessarily terrible, but most people would probably prefer Sturdy Energy on the chest. But if you want to have it on your shield, then that's a nice way to guarantee Sturdy plus Sturdy Energy plus Con. So yeah, these patterns are not terrible at least, because it saves a lot on attribute mods if you are rolling for vicious anyways. Let's look, for example, at the bow pattern here. So full dex, vicious locked, so you'd add attunement to that and then hope for 600 basically. And when you look at the materials required, it's just very standard stuff. It's your glittering ebony as well as some runic leather and some phoenix weave. So very easy craft to get at least decent weapons. And much better than the armor crafting patterns here. But that is just the rushing gear. Let's have a look at the war gear. Here you can see that the entire set has refreshing locked, which is very spicy because refreshing is currently one of the most expensive craft mods in the game. So as you can see, the attributes are once again very mixed here. You can get anything here. On the perk side, you have a very high chance to roll Resilient or Shirking Energy, or basically both as well. If you lock Resilient here, then on the next roll you have a 20% chance to get Shirking Energy if you get Legendary. But then again, you'd still have a random attribute along with that. So if you roll light, this could actually be okay, because I think you can always sell a light resilient plus shirking energy plus refreshing to someone. Someone will like those perk combinations unless it's something super niche that no one can actually use, like focus dex, for example. But you can also see that the perk pool here has a lot of random perks that don't really help us in PvP, like Ancient Ward. Now I'm not sure if this will apply for crafting next patch, and if this will apply for this particular gear, but what you could technically do with these pieces is actually utilize them differently and roll them with Ward. Because you could roll not best in slot, but what everyone uses for expeditions very easily. You could roll Ward plus Refreshing very easily. And in most cases, people don't need the legendary version of that, and it's much cheaper than rolling that with a Golden Scarab. So as long as that rules out getting Resilient on the same piece, or maybe even if it doesn't, if you get on a legendary piece with Resilient, who cares? It's still got 2 perks that you want at that point. You could just roll the Ward pieces with Refreshing, as the warring set and then just sell whatever doesn't have the attributes that you need and use the one that you want, I guess. It's definitely a very cheap way to get a baseline in terms of gear for any expedition, because all you need to do is get these resources together, or the tier 5 cooldown version of that, whatever, as well as getting some ward materials, which are very, very cheap most of the time because there are just too many of them. What is worth keeping in mind is that especially the light sets here probably won't be super cheap to get the patterns unless you're warring yourself and getting them from that, because there aren't as many wars as there are people playing OPR all the time, and obviously if they have a useful perk then they might have some value and might get a bit of a higher price than just nothing like most other patterns are. The medium and heavy set, by the way, also have refreshing, where it has a little bit less value in my opinion compared to a light set where you can just roll whatever and it will still be useful somehow. By the way, these warring sets also use the normal design of war sets, which I think looks pretty cool, especially for the light armor, so I really like that one. And for the heavy set, for example, you can also see it's the same set that you would get for normal war gear. Fivehead also suggested that maybe this is a way for people to get this as transmog if they never war. But the real big winner of all of these sets, in my opinion, are the warring weapon sets. These come attribute locked once again, like the Outpost Rush version, always with an attribute that matches them well, and they come with Keenly Jagged locked. Now I'm gonna propose something here that will upset some people, but I'm gonna propose that this is basically the easiest way to get best in slot in some ways. You can see by the way here the shields have refreshing and the tower shield has refreshing ward, so they don't really matter that much for most of us. But hear me out here. So what generally is almost always considered the best in slot in PvP is attunement with a few exceptions. And attunement is 14% weapon damage as another elemental effect per second basically, with a 1 second cooldown as long as you hit an enemy every second. Keenly Jagged on the other hand is after a crit you get 10% weapon damage per second for 6 seconds on a 7-second cooldown, so it can proc again almost immediately. This is obviously slightly more conditional, you need to crit, but there are so many builds in New World that very frequently crit and that are built around crit in general. A single hit of this, 70% weapon damage. Now there are these super niche situations where you just consistently stick to an enemy for an extended period of time and do exactly the right amount of damage, not too quick that it loses value, but also not too slow so that you have 100% uptime with attunement. Very, very niche situations compared to just proccing Keenly Jagged once, and then even if the enemy dodges away, iframes a few of your attacks, you don't hit them for multiple seconds, that's fine. They're taking damage anyways all the time from Keenly Jagged. So I'm going to propose that for single target damage specifically, Keenly Jagged is actually better than attunement for most builds, unless your build for some reason does not work well with crit at all. Especially weapons that have weaker crit scaling but guaranteed crits like the Greatsword. Really, really strong contenders to use Keenly Jagged. And this pattern gives us that all the time, with the right attribute. And on top of that, obviously, the perk buckets are not different from anywhere else. You have your normal perk chance, you have a high chance to get Vicious, you have a high chance to get Keen, which you probably want to avoid, and you have a high chance to get the other usual stuff. For an extremely high amount of weapons, getting Keenly Jagged plus Vicious is extremely strong. It is near best in slot or best in slot. And you can lock another perk. You can, for example, lock Attunement if you like Attunement, or you can lock whatever other weapon perk you want along with that. The only weapons where it's a little bit worse in terms of roll results is if you don't want Vicious, because then you're gonna roll something like Enchanted, for example, which locks out Vicious, and at that point, Keen has a very high chance to roll. So if you don't want Keen, which most people don't prefer most of the time, that's a little bit more annoying, and that's gonna lower your chances to get something actually good. But still a very good chance to get at least something decent, at least a good 2-perker or a 3-perker that is reasonably good. So in my opinion, warring weapon patterns, if they stay this way, are some of the most appealing options that we had for crafting in the game so far. And they seem to generally give us this direction that they were talking about. They were saying that they want to give us more specific activities to get specific things. And that seems to be what they're doing here. It seems to be, okay, if you want to craft Vicious gear, you go to Outpost Rush. If you want to craft Keenly Jagged gear, then you have to go to War. And then maybe in PvE you'll get other perks or something. I don't know if this is just an attempt to see how it works out, or if this is the general direction they will be taking, but it's very, very interesting to me. I don't know if we'll see these on live right away, by the way, because, well, not many wars and OPRs happening at the moment, but we will find out. Same for the drop rates as well. We still have to see what happens with that. There is a small chance that we may run into one problem, and that is the crafting recipes. So as you can see here, the crafting recipes are as normal, just shows you the required resources. It doesn't say anything about craft mods. But on the other hand, if you for example look at the crafting recipe for the Orichalcum Great Sub here, it will also not show you craft mods. That's just not how things are listed on New World Database. So I'm assuming you can use one normal craft mod for one perk. It is technically possible that these patterns work entirely without craft mods, more like event patterns, which I would hope not, but if that is the case, then obviously you can't put a single perk of any kind on them, and that would make them a fair bit worse. It wouldn't inherently make them bad. For example, I'd still take a weapon that comes with Clean Eject, Vicious, and Keen, but obviously it would take a lot of the best in slot potential away from them. Also, can I just quickly point out how absolutely clean some of the warring weapons look? I absolutely love those designs, so they're going to be cool looking weapons on top of all that as well. All in all, I think these new patterns are a great baseline for crafting some better gear. I'm interested to see what other things we can see when we get closer to the expansion. I delayed my trading tips video by another day because of this, so consider subscribing and clicking the bell if you want to get notified of that tomorrow. If you want to get those tips early, then consider supporting me on Patreon, where they are already posted. Thanks to my patrons who already do exactly that, and thank you for watching. Duke Sloth, out.